is Alice in Muggerland with the man who would be Hufflepuff, Bilious McDaniels, and Alice, the mudblood who joined the Hogwarts Express.
We're on Chapter 13, Nicholas Flamel.
Nicholas Flamel actually sounds like he has had a fairly lucky life, despite being assigned to lucky number 13 as his chapter. By the way, 13 is my favorite number, so maybe it's not that unlucky. Nicholas Flamel. They finally realized where they had seen this name before, as hinted at earlier. Harry thought he had seen it somewhere. They had been searching the library. And here, well, they stumble upon the name. And stumble is really the right word for it, because what happens is Malfoy. Yeah, what always happens for minor annoyances, nothing quite like Malfoy. Neville shows up in the Gryffindor common room by sort of falling through the portrait hole after bunny hopping it a long way because he was the victim of Malfoy's leg locker curse. In the process of trying to cheer Neville up and make him feel like he really does belong in Gryffindor, and I do think it makes perfect sense. Since he was an outcast his whole life and feeling like an outcast, it doesn't surprise me at all that now that he's part of a group, it's very important to him to make other people feel welcome and part of the same group. So Neville shows up feeling disheartened, not only because his legs had been locked together and he'd had to bunny hop from goodness knows where in Hogwarts. He had also been told that he didn't belong in Gryffindor. And so Harry gives him his last chocolate frog that he'd gotten from Hermione for Christmas. And Neville eats it and gives Harry the cards, which he's still collecting. And on that card is Dumbledore again. And this is actually where the name Nicholas Flamel seemed familiar from, because the card reads that he was famous for defeating the dark wizard Grindelwald, for discovering uses for dragon's blood, and for his work on alchemy with his partner, Nicholas Flamel. So that answers that question. Nicholas Flamel is Dumbledore's partner.
Yep, all the way back to Chapter 6.
That's all very interesting. Especially because Hermione, who had, gone to the library for a bit of light reading in the form of a large volume, is able to immediately find out more about Mr. Flamel, and the fact that what he is really famous for is that he's the only person who has successfully made a Sorcerer's Stone.
Thus the name.
Since we're reading Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, it must be a pretty important stone. The book she has states that the stone will transform any metal into pure gold and produces the elixir of life, which will make the drinker immortal. Pretty good combination. We've got Mr. Flamel celebrating his 665th birthday with his wife, Perennial, 658. And so,
Perennial.
Yeah, well, Perennial, clearly another one of these wonderful puns, because it looks and reads like perennial. Just saying.
But this goes back a couple of chapters ago when you were asking, doesn't the magical world have alchemy? When we were talking about trying to transmute precious metals
into gold. Yep,
so,
it absolutely does.
Yep.
But because the wizarding world, everything is bigger and better, it doesn't just give you gold, it gives you immortality. Pretty good deal. Meanwhile, that's the main story arc. We know that Dumbledore had a partner named Nicholas Flamel who created the Sorcerer's Stone. We now have a very good idea of what it is in that little package that Hagrid brought back from Gringotts and why it's so valuable. But Harry has another Quidditch match, which I am really excited about, especially since in this case it is, if they can manage to win this Quidditch match against Hufflepuff, they will be able to overtake Slytherin in the House Championship for the first time in 7 years. So the stakes are especially high for this match. And there's a problem, of course, in the form of Professor Snape, who has managed to get himself assigned as the referee for the Quidditch match between Hufflepuff and Gryffindor that will probably decide the house championship. Essentially, this is putting the fox in charge of the hen house. If Harry can't catch the snitch in record time, Professor Snape is going to penalize Gryffindor into oblivion. Hermione and Ron aren't really concerned about the outcome of the Quidditch match so much as whether or not their friend Harry will survive it under Snape's refereeing. As we've seen in the previous match, he can be dangerously wicked towards Harry.
I just like how they're like, say you broke your leg, really break your leg.
Yeah. So, Hermione's suggestion is pretend to have broken your leg, and Ron says really break your leg. Basically, Ron's saying that it would be better to actually break your leg than to have to play Quidditch with Snape as your referee, which is saying something. So, day of the match approaches. Everyone's in attendance, including Dumbledore. I was a little surprised that was a big deal that Dumbledore was coming to the match. I would have assumed he'd be at every Quidditch match, but maybe he's not as big a fan as Professor McGonagall. Another part of this chapter that they talk about is that Harry has been continuing to, and this started previously, but since finding the mirror and seeing his family, Harry is suffering from more and more nightmares about his family and how his parents died. And he finds that the distraction of Quidditch and practicing actually helps him to sleep better. The practices are wearing him out, and this is sort of an ongoing thing with him in his dreams. It'll be interesting to see how his dreams continue to play a role in these stories in the future. The day of the match finally arrives. Everyone is in attendance, of course, including Ron and Hermione, who have brought their wands with them. And I thought that was kind of interesting because I sort of assumed that wizards took their wands everywhere, but apparently that's not the case.
Well, when you're in a completely magical environment, sometimes you don't think that you actually have to carry the wand everywhere because you don't have to worry about what might pop up. And it's a school. You're supposed to be safe at all times, so you don't really need to be carrying your wand just to go to a Quidditch match. And in fact, usually when people bring their wands to Quidditch matches, or at least have their wands visible at Quidditch matches, they get looked at very carefully so they don't go through and possibly change the result of the match with outside interference.
Well, that makes sense. You wouldn't want people magically cheating at Quidditch.
Exactly.
So there's a description of the match. As expected, Snape is penalizing Gryffindor pretty heavily right away. Meanwhile, Malfoy and his thugs are up in the stands picking on Hermione and Ron and Neville. Hermione is managing to ignore them and watch the match. In fact, they're not really picking on her that much. They don't say anything about the fact that she's a muggle. I'm sure that's to come, but they are teasing Ron about being poor and Neville about being Neville, really. And Ron eventually snaps and attacks Malfoy, so that's interesting. Ron has sort of this well of anger inside him, and it comes out.
And Neville helps.
He does. He gets knocked out cold, but he does help. Meanwhile, Harry spots the snitch, grabs it out of the air, and finishes the game in record time. Interestingly, when he spots the snitch, it's very near Snape, so sort of imagining this sharp dive through the air right past his nemesis to grab the snitch. He's got to get some style points for that. Yeah, so they win. Everybody's very excited. Snape is the only person who doesn't look happy at the end of this, though I'm sure there's a bunch of disappointed Hufflepuffs. I mean, I imagine they also like their Quidditch, right? So, doesn't...
Hufflepuffs like their Quidditch. So... But Hufflepuffs are good sports. They probably actually, to be quite honest, the fact that Snape gave a penalty to Hufflepuff for no reason at all, they probably were questioning that too, because Hufflepuffs like fair play.
You mean they gave a penalty to Gryffindor for no reason?
No, they called a penalty on
Right.
Gryffindor. The way that it's written, it's like they
I
gave
see.
the penalty to Hufflepuff, as in they gave a penalty shot.
Right. So at the end of this match, Harry is once again the Quidditch hero. Ron is got a bloody nose. Neville is out cold after his fight. And Hermione is, she's fine. She's very happy. So they're all celebrating, and while they're kind of in the midst of this and he's getting ready to go to dinner, he spots something very suspicious. He sees Snape heading off into the Forbidden Forest, which, as the name suggests, is forbidden. So that's very unusual. Harry, being sort of impetuous, decides to follow him, even though it's into the Forbidden Forest. And he spies on Snape, who is meeting with, of all people, Professor Quirrell. And they're having a very tense conversation, but Harry does hear that what the conversation about is the Sorcerer's Stone. So having found out about its existence on their own, they soon have it confirmed that that is really and truly the thing that Snape is after, that's being guarded by Fluffy. And Quirrell has something to do with this, and it's not really clear to me yet exactly what his role in it, but Snape seems to be threatening Quirrell that Quirrell needs to check where his loyalties lie. And in this case, Snape is suggesting that his loyalties should lie with Snape, because otherwise Snape is going to make his life very difficult. It's as I said, a very tense exchange. Kind of hard to imagine Quirrell being all that formidable, but maybe he's got more of a backbone under there than we think. Ron doesn't seem to agree, because when Harry comes back to Hogwarts and reports this to Ron and Hermione, Ron's comment is it'll be gone by next Tuesday. So basically, if all that is standing between Professor Snape and the Sorcerer's Stone is Professor Quirrell, there is very little hope. So that is where our story is.
So I want to bring up one thing in regards to just relationships in the book. It shows not only are do they kind of try to give Harry advice on avoiding the Quidditch match, but it seems like that they've gone through and on their own went to about learning a difficult spell just in case Snape was going to try
Well, I don't know how
something.
difficult that spell is if Malfoy could do it correctly.
Well, you got to think about Malfoy too, because Malfoy is a Slytherin, and who knows what his upbringing is like since his whole family is Slytherins. So a jinx like that is basically just going through to make someone miserable, sounds like a very Slytherin
So
thing
is
to
magic
do.
easier if it's sort of your nature?
It can be, yes. Especially things such as healing spells, for example. Not only does it take a lot of study, but the magic has a power to it that as you mature and as you do more and more magic, you improve along with your wand, so to speak. So it's one of those things where the more that you're into a subject, it could be the better that you are in general. As we'll find out later on about Harry and his future subjects and other things that go through with the various wizards that we have spoke about. But yeah, it's when it comes down to jinxes and hexes and things of that nature, many first year students can't go through and pull those off. Um, it's one of those things where you have to have at least a little bit of power behind it to be able to actually pull off effectively. So we know that Malfoy may be a little bit advanced, but we also know that Hermione, at least with counter jinxes, for example, is advanced with that because not only does she care about her subjects now, but she's also starting to care more about the wizarding community besides just getting house points.
Hmm.
But I do like Harry. Also, you mentioned it about how Harry wants to have people actually feel involved with telling Neville that he's worth 12 a Malfoy, to the point that Neville echoes that before he dives into the melee of Ron, Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle.
Right. Yeah, Harry does a very good job of bucking up Neville's spirits when he comes hopping into the common room. And just to clarify, he had been the victim of a leg locker curse that was placed on him by Malfoy, and this is the same curse that Hermione and Ron have learned and prepared to take with them to the Quidditch match in preparation of disabling Snape. Which I imagine that a leg locker curse while you're on a broomstick would be particularly unpleasant.
I would
Yeah.
think so too. It depends on how you ride your broom, but if you ride it properly, yeah, it would be very unpleasant.
Luckily, they don't have to use it because, as I said, Harry catches the snitch in record time.
So, in this chapter, who is your favorite character?
Probably Ron. Pretty spunky. Certainly he does try to ignore Malfoy and his buddies, and it really is when they kind of lump onto Neville that he just loses it and goes after them. So, yeah, I like Ron.
Ron is very much, I feel like, a major soul in regards to the three, because I think he keeps it real. Don't fake it, just do it. That's kind of thing.
And certainly a good guy to have on your side. Very loyal.
All right. Is there anything else that you'd like to bring
No,
up?
I mean, this is a relatively short chapter, but it moves things along significantly with the discovery of what a Sorcerer's Stone is, which again, that's the title of the book. So I have a feeling we haven't heard the last about that, and the fact that Snape and is definitely out to get it, and Professor Quirrell is wrapped up in that somehow. So stay tuned.
All right. Now, before we go and usually do our usual sign-offs, I want to bring something up. After this, we're going to have only 4 chapters remaining of the first Harry Potter book. So, I know it's a little bit premature about this, but what has your overall feelings and thoughts been about reading through these documents?
Well, I mean, so far, the books they're exceptionally well written. I like some of the themes that we see from other stories that get echoed in it, and I'm very curious to see now at this point, who these characters are going to become. Certainly, if this book had been a standalone book, I'd be a little worried about the character development at this point. But knowing that there are, 6 more books after this, I have a feeling that they're going to be exceptionally well-rounded by the time we reach the end.
So, next week, we're going to be moving on to chapter 14. That chapter is Norbert the Norwegian Ridgeback, where we continue the rest of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone.
Until next week, Knox.
You can't turn out the lights by saying Knox, Alice. That's my job. Knox.
No, Quidditch is fine. It's a great game. Would love to see it sometime. All right. Oh, God, what is wrong with me?